Hello, everyone. My name is Quentin Verspieren. I'm an assistant professor of space policy at the University of Tokyo, specifically at the Graduate School of Public Policy. And today's event is organized by the Science, Technology, and Innovation Governance Program. So before starting with the content of this event with the great keynote by Dr. Sese and the great panel that will follow, let me give you a brief introduction to why we organize this event and on which particular event this idea is based. Okay, yes. So today's event is actually part of a series of policy seminars that are organized frequently by the STIG program on various topics of science, technology, and innovation governance, as the name indicates, sometime on biomedical, energy. And it is the first time that we have so-called STIG Space Policy Seminar. So it's our first event of this kind, and we hope to have every month, around the beginning of the month, STIG Space Policy Seminar or webinar in the current situation. And this inaugural webinar is titled ASEAN Space Programs, Policy Considerations. And you will understand why the STIG program and more generally space policy researchers at the University of Tokyo have this specific interest on the ASEAN. So I will first introduce the STIG program, what it is, what we do, who are the main space policy experts in the program, and then introduce today's event. The STIG program is an educational and research program on technology governance. Basically, it is part of a government program called SCIREX, meaning Science for Policy and Policy for Science, which is a program of the Ministry of Education and Science of Japan that try to bridge the policy knowledge in universities and research institutes with, I would say, scientific graduate schools in the same universities, so as to support the development of sound science policy in the Japanese government. And as part of this SCIREX program, an ensemble of programs were created in various partner universities, including at the University of Tokyo, and the University of Tokyo implementation of the SCIREX program is what I introduced before, the STIG program, Science, Technology, and Innovation Governance Program. And as part of this program, you really have most of the graduate schools of the University of Tokyo, and we pride ourselves of being this interdisciplinary. So I represent the Graduate School of Public Policy, but we also have members for the Graduate School of Law and Politics, Economics, Medicine, Engineering, of course, etc., etc. And as part of this overall SCIREX program of the Japanese government, we have this interdisciplinary research network with other universities having implemented their own version of the STIG program. So this is basically to tell you a bit more about what we do at the STIG program. So we have at the same time interdisciplinary courses that try to bridge between natural sciences, engineering, and on the other side, humanities and social science, as well as studies on science and technology policy. And our idea is to welcome all kinds of students, whether they are from humanities and social science or from natural sciences, and through this program, make them able to fill some roles that are necessary in modern governments and in modern countries like Japan, whether they would be policymaking specialists, R&D managers, or science, technology, and innovation policy researchers like me, basically. And I was myself an alumni of the STIG program. Since its inception, the STIG program has provided graduate certificates in science and technology policy to around 200 students. 25%, roughly 25% from the School of Public Policy, 25% from the Graduate School of Engineering, and the rest, I would say 45 to 50%, is a combination of all other graduate schools at the University of Tokyo. And this is really, I want to emphasize this figure because it shows that at any given moment in a research project or a course affiliated to the STIG program, you will have students with really varied backgrounds, and we often make them work into groups, and it really creates very interesting synergies and interdisciplinarity among these students. So at the STIG program, as I said, we have experts of various topics of science, technology, and innovation governance, whereas that's energy, biomedical, nuclear research. And one of the most recent addition to the STIG program is space policy research. And we currently have 3 faculty members that are 3 full-time faculty members, specialists of space policy research. The head of the STIG program himself, Professor Shiroyama, Professor Kazuto Suzuki, who is the most renowned space policy expert in Japan, and myself. And in addition to us, the 3 full-time faculty, we have numerous part-time researcher and visiting faculty helping us for various projects and courses, such as Professor Nagai from Nihon University, Dr. Takaya from Waseda University, as well as experts from JAXA, Mr. Kikuchi and Dr. Kuriyama. And as I said, one of the key aspects of the STIG program is interdisciplinarity. So we have also affiliated faculty, and in particular for space, we have Professor Shinichi Nakasuka, Professor of Space Engineering, and member of the National Space Policy Committee of the Government of Japan. Part of our activities, and in particular faculty activities, is of course publication of books and articles related to public policy, a strong presence in media and conferences to do as much outreach as possible on space policy, which is still a topic that is maybe not so present in major media, despite the importance of space activities in our societies. And we are involved in various Japanese and international government projects. And most of us are not only focusing on Japan, but also affiliated with other organizations abroad. And I put here the illustration of the latest book that we published, including 2 members of the STIG program, myself and Professor Shiroyama. That is at the origin of today's session, but I will give you a bit more details in a couple of minutes. We also have educational activities because before all, the STIG program is an educational program aiming at providing a student with science, technology, and innovation governance knowledge and having them get a certificate, so an official certification in this field. And we have, of course, pure space policy courses, but also a lot of other courses that include space affairs, but that are not entirely on space affairs. And our curriculum is basically aiming at 2 types of students, I would say. Pure students, meaning that they did their bachelor, master, and PhD at once, who are interested in either academic or research career in space policy, or who want to integrate government and industry in space policy related positions. But at the same time, we have a big number of students who are already working for governments or companies who are restarting studies often at master level and who want to specialize in space policy because it's useful in their governmental or industrial jobs. So if you are in one of these 2 categories and you want to learn more about space policy and you're interested in the University of Tokyo, please reach out to us. You can find our contacts on the website of the STIG program. You just have to type STIG University of Tokyo on Google and you will easily find our information. Our current research activities cover the whole spectrum of space policy research: space safety, sustainability, space security, space development in developing countries, like today's session, space technology development and utilization, capacity building, technology governance, lunar and cislunar governance. We really have experts covering almost everything in terms of space policy research. So whatever is your interest, you could find someone at the University of Tokyo and at the STIG program who could help you develop your projects and knowledge on this issue. And most of our research funding comes from Japanese government projects, mostly by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sport, Science and Technology, so-called MEXT, and by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, as I explained at the beginning of my presentation, today's event is the first space policy webinar of the STIG program. And we intend to have regular webinars like this one on a monthly basis, usually at the beginning of the month. So I will mention that at the end of this event. Our next space policy webinar will be on on-orbit servicing and active debris removal, so all kind of rendezvous and proximity operations in space. And will be in early March, and we'll communicate on the exact date and time of the event in a few days. And we really want to cover any kind of relevant space policy topic for this webinar, whether ASEAN countries like today, space as critical infrastructure, space education, space security as in Japan or as part of structures like the Quad, bilateral cooperation between Japan and some countries such as France, etc., etc. Okay, so to conclude on the STIG program and our space policy research, we have a very diverse space policy education offer and numerous research projects. So there is no doubt that in Asia, we are the leading space policy education and research center. So if you're interested in learning about space policy in general, but even more on space policy in the context of Asia Pacific, I strongly recommend you to join us. Our programs are open to students, early or mid-career professional, interested in pursuing master or PhD degree in public policy, with a concentration in space policy. And if you are already a researcher in universities, research institute, government agency, industry, you can, of course, contact us with joint research proposals. And what we want to do overall with our publication, our lecture, and most of all with events like this one, is to contribute to disseminating space-related information in the Asia-Pacific region. Because it is a region where space technologies are extremely important for a variety of reasons. And you will understand that really well with the keynote and the panel. However, there may be less overall understanding about the importance of space technology in the region, and we want to contribute to so disseminating more and more information about that. Now, today's webinar, as I mentioned before, is based on the fact that we recently published a book, thanks to our publisher, Springer Nature, titled ASEAN Space Programs, History and Way Forward. The reason for the publication of this book is the fact that many of us at the University of Tokyo, having interest in space policy, were willing to understand the importance of space technology in the development of countries in Asia Pacific and even more specifically in ASEAN. However, we realized that information on existing space programs or current initiatives of ASEAN countries is very limited. Either there is no real deep information about historically what these countries have been done in terms of space activities, or it is only available in vernacular languages. typically in Indonesia. Before this book, the only real detailed books or papers that you could find about the Indonesian space program were in local languages, but not in English. And so we decided, relying on a network of friends and experts, to edit a book with contributions from leading experts from each ASEAN country on what was the history of space programs in these countries and what are the latest and future developments to be expected from these space programs. And we divided the book into roughly two parts. The first part on established space programs, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. For purely editorial reason, we had to drop a chapter that was planned on Thailand, but Thailand is, of course, a major space program in the region. So it's the only country that is absent from country chapters, but it's addressed in other chapters. I will mention that. And as you may have noticed, our great author for Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore are three of our speakers today. And so we wanted to organize this event with the authors so that they can explain why they have contributed to this book, what they have explained in the book, and because we believe that their message and the lessons that you can learn from what they have written about their country is extremely valuable for anyone in the region interested in space policy in developing countries. And the second part of the book was written mostly by us, the editors, and it is more, I would say, analytical perspective on existing space programs and I would say new emerging space countries in the region, and trying to identify and compile good lessons or sometimes bad practices too that should be avoided. But our goal was really with the second part to create some kind of manual that any government official in the developing countries willing to start a space program could look at and say, okay, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, they have done things. They have an interesting space program. They have done some things right, something wrong. What lessons can we find? And so these lessons are present, in this book. And so it's really a manual that we believe can be really helpful for any country willing to start a space program, not only in Asia Pacific. Most of the lessons are valid for any country. Concretely, for the organization of today's event, we'll first have a keynote of Dr. Rogel Sese from the Philippines, who, to put it simply, is the father of the Filipino space program. He will deliver a keynote on his experience, a long keynote with a lot of details, and I'm sure you will have a lot of questions for him afterwards. And the keynote will be followed by a panel, including Dr. Sese, who will be joined by Dr. Norilmi Amilia Ismail from Universiti Sains Malaysia and Malaysia Space Initiative, Mr. David Holichiam from Singapore Space and Technology Limited, and Mr. Maximilian Berthet from the University of Tokyo, one of the co-editors and the main co-editors of the book. So I will stop sharing my screen and we will move to the keynote of Dr. Sese. So let me introduce a bit more who is Dr. Sese, apart from being a great friend and a great support to our activities at the University of Tokyo for what concerns ASEAN Space Programs. So Dr. Sese is a member of the Board of Trustees and the chair of the Department of Aerospace Engineering at the Ateneo de Davao University in Davao in southern Philippines. He's also the program leader of the Ateneo de Davao Community Connectivity Empowered by Satellite Services for Mindanao. To put it simply, you can call that Access Mindanao, which is a research and advocacy program of the Ateneo de Davao University that aims to provide internet connectivity to remote and isolated areas in Mindanao using satellite technology. But for what concerns mostly the 2 days presentation, Dr. Sese led the National Space Development Program of the Filipino government, which crafted the Philippine Space Development and Utilization Policy and the proposal for the creation of the Philippine Space Agency, which eventually became Republic Act 11-363, or so-called the Philippine Space Act, the country's first national space law. He has also worked with the private sector and served as a consultant of the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Air Force, and the Department of National Defense for several years. So basically, you understand that we are really lucky to have Dr. Sese with us today. And so without further ado, I will now let Dr. Sese deliver his keynote. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, thank you, Quentin, for that very generous introduction. Pleasant good afternoon to everyone. It's my honor to be here, to be invited to serve as from what I understood, the first keynote speaker for the series of space policy seminars from STIG. So this is quite an honor and for me that I will be able to share to you about the experience that I had in the Philippines in creating the space program, specifically the space policy aspect. And let me share my screen. So you can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, so for this afternoon, I'll be talking about the experience of the Philippines in terms of establishing the space program. And this goes from just not just from the technology development side, but also from the policy legislation aspect. So this is something that I think for the past 10 years, something that I have worked on. And bulk of this work was actually done under the National Space Development Program, which was the program tasked by the Department of Science and Technology to develop, to craft the policies and the legislation aspect for the current Philippine space program that we have. Although right now I'm affiliated at the Ateneo de Davao University here in Mindanao, so in the southern part of the Philippines. Okay. So first, when we look at the history of space capabilities, we have gone a long way in the past 60 years that different countries, primarily advanced countries like United States and Russia, who were the leaders during the early age of the space age. During that time, we've seen that most of these countries or most of the space activities are actually very much done on a national governmental level. Okay, so however, fast forward to the current generation now, we have seen that from that very small group of countries that started the space age, we have seen that there are more and more countries that are slowly jumping into having space technology, space capabilities or space technology and applications in various aspects. And these are not just limited to what we call established space nation, but also slowly now we see more and more countries that are trying to start their own space programs, not just in here in Southeast Asia, but also in other areas like in Latin America and even in Africa. So this goes to show that in the past 60 years, space has been more or less democratized to the point that now it's no longer a luxury for a national government to embark on a space development program, but rather it's already a necessity because we are now at that stage that we understand the technological advantages that having space capabilities can bring. So that can come in various forms, whether it's in terms of academic research, innovation, industry development, and economic development, and even in social services. So just like what was mentioned right now in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're very much reliant on connectivity, and part of the program that I'm handling right now is the Access Mindanao program, which provides connectivity to remote areas using satellite technology. So in the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot of countries embark on establishing their own national space agencies. So we have Bahrain, Australia, UAE. UAE right now is very popular or very much in the news because of their high-profile missions. Luxembourg, New Zealand, Poland, and Portugal. And of course, among these countries, one of the youngest right now is the Philippines, which we now have the Philippine Space Agency, which was established in 2019. So we can think of the Philippines as what we call an emerging space nation. So among the ASEAN countries, the reality is that the Philippines was a little bit late in the game in terms of developing its space capabilities. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't done any space-related activities in the past. In fact, we've been doing a lot of space-related activities, mostly on the side of on the academic side or the research side, particularly in optical and radio astronomy, which is something that ever since 1800s we've been doing that. In the early 1970s, we used to have a rocket development program known as Project Santa Barbara. So this was a classified military project wherein the rockets were developed, launched, and tested within the territory of the Philippines. Most of these rockets are already decommissioned, and it showed that even at that stage, there has been some awareness in terms of developing capabilities for space. The Philippines was also a member of the UN COPWAS since 1977, and we even launched our first telecommunication satellite in 1997. We call this the Aguila 2, which was in orbit for almost 20 years. So it was only around, I think, 2017 that it was finally decommissioned. Under the Department of Science and Technology, we have the Philippine Space Science Education Program under the Science Education Institute, which since 2005 has been working on popularizing and increasing awareness for space technology, mainly in schools like elementary schools and high school. The Philippines has been an active participant of Sentinel Asia, and this is one of the projects that was done in collaboration with Japan along with other partners. One of the very first moves to really push for space capabilities to have a space law in the Philippines was the proposed Philippine Space Act of 2012, which unfortunately did not prosper. But then it was also fortunate because it gave the Philippines some amount of time to step back and see, okay, we're venturing towards space capabilities. Sorry, something happened. Okay. So we're venturing towards space capabilities. What do we want to do for the country, and how are we going to push forward in terms of space development? So at the same time, we also had a partnership. The University of the Philippines had a partnership with Hokkaido University and Tohoku University, which resulted in the very high-profile launching of the Diwata microsatellites and eventually also the Maya CubeSats. And because of these activities that have been in a very short amount of time, imagine from 2012 all the way to 2016, in 2016, the Philippines hosted the 23rd Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. So this is one of the key regional forums spearheaded by the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, or JAXA. And this was the very first time that the Philippines hosted this high-profile event. So we had one of the largest participation of space experts during the APRCF. On the legal side, of course, when we look at the different international space treaties, among the 5 major treaties, the Philippines actually is a signatory to 3 of them: the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, and the Liability Convention. Unfortunately, the Philippines did not sign and did not ratify the Registration Convention. But one of the strange things here when we were looking at it before is that despite not ratifying the OST, which is the Central Space Treaty in space law, the Philippines actually ratified. We're one of the few countries in the world that actually ratified the Moon Agreement. And this is something that we've been trying to unearth on why the Philippines ratified the Moon Agreement, but not the more important agreement like the OST or the Liability Convention. So this is something that we're still trying to look into. And very interesting how things have progressed since then. And as I mentioned, because of the one of the reasons for the democratization of space capabilities towards emerging space nations is that we understand now that there are actually a lot of benefits for having a national space program. And it can come in various forms. For here in the Philippines, we've identified most of these, mainly in agriculture and fisheries, environment and land use monitoring, communications, because we're the second largest archipelago in the world, second only to Indonesia. So we have around more than 7,600 islands that needs to be connected, so that we can deliver social services. And also, we're also one of the hotspots for disaster, particularly for typhoons. We experience around 20 typhoons a year on average, and we're located in the Pacific Ring of Fire. We don't get as much earthquakes as Japan, but we get much more typhoons, and usually much stronger ones. One of the strongest typhoons that hit the Philippines in recent memory was actually just last month in Super Typhoon Odette, which devastated parts of Mindanao and parts of the Visayas group of islands. There's also a lot of need for space capabilities in transportation, whether that's for maritime transportation in internal and territorial waters. Of course, we know that having space capabilities can spur trade, industry, and economic growth. We've done some initial studies in terms of how much return of investment will the Philippines have for every peso invested, and that averages around 2.4 pesos, or about 2.4 times, which is a very conservative estimate, given that in the global average is about 4 times in the terms of return ROI. Of course, we want to improve science and technology capabilities in the academe and the research capabilities and education, and we also look into the other aspect because of space capabilities, because space is a dual-use technology. So there are civilian applications and there are military applications. So it's important that we are cognizant that space would also have applications in defense and security. And of course, lastly, in terms of international diplomacy, wherein we cooperate with other countries in terms of space development and space capabilities. So as I said, the development of the Philippine Space Agency, or the Philippine Space Program, actually took quite a while, about a decade, more or less, or less than a decade. And this started sometime around 2012, 2013. So prior to that, there have been very minimal talk in the country in terms of having capabilities for space, because the prevailing mindset during that time is that space is only something that rich countries or rich nations can have. So it's not something that a country like the Philippines, which is a developing country, would venture into. But back then in 2012 and 2013, in retrospect, there have been several events, or a couple of events, that led to the change in mindset for not just for the public, but also for the government. And primarily these involves a little civilian application and the military application. On the military side, or on the defense side, the prevailing issue on the South China Sea right now with territorial disputes. And one of the reasons why the Philippines finds it very hard to monitor what is happening there is because of the lack of space capabilities, particularly for Earth observation and remote sensing. But then there's also the civilian side, wherein in 2013, Typhoon Yolanda, or Super Typhoon Haiyan, struck the Philippines. And this was actually prior to Odette, one of the strongest typhoons that hit the country. And it basically devastated all the ground infrastructure for telecommunications. And the only way that people can communicate was through the use of satellite technology. And this is something that was demonstrated much more recently, again, during Typhoon Odette last December 2021, wherein in particular, the Dinagat Islands here in the Philippines, which is one of our sites. It's a whole province that right in the forefront, or was bore the brunt of the super typhoon, and basically all the ground-based infrastructure for telecommunications. And even up to now, they're still in the process of fixing everything. Everything was wiped out, and the only way that people can communicate for the whole island that time was the satellite antenna that we installed in just last November. So it was very fortuitous that we installed it in November. So that was the only way that the local government can communicate to the national government on the extent of their damage and what they need in terms of recovery. So this is something that time and time again has been shown to be one of the major applications of space capabilities in the Philippines. So, and in 2013, the Philippine Council for Industry, Energy, and Emerging Technology Research and Development, for Research and Development, or DOST, PSHERD, under the Department of Science and Technology, commissioned a study to the Manila Observatory to conduct a baseline research for space activities and infrastructure. Basically, this is a survey of the infrastructure, the human assets that are currently available in the country. And from there, one of the strongest recommendations was actually there's a need for national space, for having a national space policy, because there have been a lot of activities related to space, but all of these have been done individually by different agencies. So there's no coherent strategy or policy that would bind all these space activities, which eventually led to waste of resources or even duplication of resources. So during the crafting of the National Space Development and Utilization Policy, this involved the analysis of foreign space programs and policies. So basically, it's not copying what the other space policies have in their plans, but mainly looking at which among these are applicable to the Philippine situation. And that's something that has to be taken into account as well. We did a multi-sectoral stakeholder consultation for academe, government, industry, and in the defense sector, and even regional and international consultations. In 2014 and until 2018, 2019, we had a cooperation with Japan for first technical cooperation for the development of the Diwata 1 and Diwata 2, which was the first microsatellites launched by the Philippines. We've developed several ground receiving stations. I think there are 3 now, all scattered all over the country. And in 2015, we conduct DOST PSHERD commissioned the National Space Development Program, which was basically tasked to develop a cost-benefit analysis and establish the key space roadmaps and agenda and the strategy on how to get this legislated. So, and of course, the last part from 2016 to 2019, we have been working on, or we worked on developing the legislation of the Philippine Space Agency and policy. So this is more on the lobbying and proposing to politicians and decision makers, that making them understand the necessity for a space agency and policy, as well as what benefit the country can have from this. So under the National Space Development Program, we crafted 4 major roadmaps: the National Space Research and Development Agenda, the Satellite Development Roadmap, which identified what are the various satellites that the Philippines would need in the next 10 years. So this was in 2015. The Satellite Data Sharing and Management Policy, and of course, also the Space Industry Development Roadmap, which identified which niche areas the Philippines can venture into when it comes to space technology, particularly in space subsystems production, satellite assembly, integration and testing, space applications and services, and launch services as well. So all of this eventually ended up in this particular document, which is considered now as a law in the Philippines, Republic Act 11363, or the Philippine Space Act. So this is the first space law of the Philippines that establishes the creation of the Philippine Space Agency and the Philippine Space Development and Utilization Policy. So this was signed into law on August 8 of 2019, and it establishes PhilSA as the central government agency addressing all national issues and activities related to space and science and space science and technology applications. But what is unique in this bill is it's not just a creation of a government agency, but at the same time, it was also a creation of the space policy, because this was an offshoot from the baseline research activity or research that was done by Manila Observatory, that there is a need that if the Philippines will venture into space development, both the agency and the policy has to be created at the same time in order to be for it to work. So if we cannot create an agency that has no clear-cut policy guidelines, and because it would find it hard, it would have a hard time in identifying what it would need to do. At the same time, we cannot create a policy without an agency that would implement it, because that would now become just a piece of paper. So here, in one law, both the agency and the policy were created, and the space policy focuses on 6 key development areas. So these were the identified areas on why the Philippines would venture into space development. So namely, in order of their appearance, it's national security and development, hazard management and climate studies, space research and development, space industry capacity building, space education and awareness, and international cooperation. So this was the result of the various stakeholder consultations that was done under the NSDP and under the baseline research program as well. So it mandates also the PhilSA to be the primary policy, planning, coordinating, and administrative entity of the executive branch. It has various functions, and for administrative purposes, the Philippine Space Agency was legislated to be an attached agency under the Office of the President. So it's not under any ministry or department. This is working directly under the President of the Office of the President of the Republic of the Philippines for purposes of policy and program coordination. So because the prevailing thought here is that space technology and space capabilities has a wide range of applications. So it's more important, it's better to have it under the Office of the President so that it can easily coordinate with the various departments, whether for science and technology, for defense, for agriculture, for environment, and natural resources, trade and industry, and even in foreign affairs. It also puts the official site of PhilSA, although this is still something that is under development, in 30-hectare piece of land in Clark Clark Special Economic Zone, which is about 100 kilometers north of Metro Manila. So that's the future home of PhilSA. Sorry. So it also establishes the Space Council, okay, which is the oversight committee for PhilSA. The funds for PhilSA was also established there. That includes funds coming from the annual general appropriation and also from income, fees, royalties, and revenues. And there's a specific section on the Philippine Space Development Fund. So this serves something like a seed money for the Philippine Space Agency, amounting to about $10 billion, 10 billion pesos, sorry, not $10 billion, 10 billion pesos, which is about $200 million to be taken from the national government. And this will be disbursed in tranches of about 2 billion pesos every year. And yeah, so that's mainly for capital outlay because of the high cost of the infrastructure for space technology. And one of the unique things also in the law is it also provides, or it also paves the effort of the future efforts in terms of being compliant with international space law, particularly on the Registration Convention and the Liability Convention. So in accordance to the Registration Convention, the PhilSA will maintain the National Registry of Space Objects registered under the Philippines as a launching state, and regularly informs UNOSA on the information contained therein. And also the Liability Convention assumes the responsibility of the Philippine government for any objects registered under the National Registry, provided that these two clauses will take into effect upon ratification of the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention. And lastly, there's also a clause in terms of appropriations that the initial seed money for the operations of PhilSA would be around 1 billion pesos, or about $20 million. Okay, so now because the PhilSA has been, the RA 11363 has been established in 2019. So by August of this year, that will be the 3 years now since PhilSA. So looking at the situation, it's a little different from what was initially envisioned before. So I divided this into 3 particular sections. The office and the operation. So currently the PhilSA maintains its office within the Triple E building of the University of the Philippines, Diliman in Quezon City. So based on the documents coming from the Department of Budget and Management, only 16 out of the 194 authorized positions are filled. So there's still a lot of opportunity for growth and development, especially in terms of human resources. And PhilSA maintains a website, but with limited information. Currently, it has also promulgated the implementing rules of and regulations of RA 11363. So in any law in the Philippines, there is an attached implementing rules and regulations, or IRR. So that fleshes out the details on how the Republic Act will be implemented. However, except for some sections, most of the IRR was just a restatement of the original content found in RA 11363. Also, there are a few programs that were publicly stated, such as Incentivize and Ad-Astra. So Incentivize is a space industry partnership program, particularly for using satellite communications using low Earth orbit satellites. And I think last week, they announced that this is a partnership with OneWeb. And Ad-Astra is the scholarship program for students who would want to take advanced studies related to space technology development. PhilSA is also continuing its current line of Diwata and Maya heritage, microsatellites and nanosatellites. So there's already a significant heritage coming from these two lines. And also the MULA, or the multi-user for satellite for land assessment, is also in the pipeline. However, one of the issues right now is the funding situation, because despite what was stated in RA 11363, the current funding for the Philippine Space Agency is much lower than what was initially planned. And looking at it for the current year, for 2022, PhilSA was allocated only 179 million. So basically around $3.5 million. So this is much lower than what was initially expected, and this is even lower than what was from previous years, previous funding for 2021. So with the upcoming presidential elections in the Philippines here in 2022, one of the things that we in the space sector are very hopeful is that whoever wins the next presidential elections should have a little bit more focus in terms of funding and capacitating PhilSA as well. Okay, so just to wrap up my talk, I think that's the last part. Some policy recommendations for emerging space policy making recommendations for emerging space nations based on the experience that the Philippines had. And this is something that I've been sharing for almost 4 or 5 years now. On how come the Philippines was able to do a lot in very short amount of time. And these are what we can say the lessons learned that we had from our own experience. So first, for any country that is or wanting to develop their space capabilities or space agency or policy, there's a need to conduct a baseline study or assessment on what are the existing space assets, infrastructures, and capabilities within your country. And also analyze the different space policies and programs of other countries, not with the idea of copying what other countries have done, but mainly for assessing which of these space policies and programs would be suitable to be implemented in your country, because each country is different. We have our own different national interests, economic situations, and so on. So it's important that those experiences from other countries are contextualized, are taken into context using local realities, local political realities in a particular country. You want to involve as many various agencies and sectors, even those that haven't realized yet that they would benefit from having space technology and applications in crafting of the policy. Because it creates some sort of buy-in as well. So when the time comes that you need support from other sectors, especially in terms of legislation, you have these other sectors that can help you in terms of pushing national space policy. You need to have a small but dedicated team who would do the legwork, especially in crafting the policies and roadmap. We have a saying, too many cooks spoil the broth. Okay, so do the stakeholder consultation, but then when it comes to the nitty-gritty details of writing everything, you don't need a huge team for that. It's just a small dedicated team. You also need to have a long-term perspective on space development, but you have to take into account the reality and the short-term political situation. So you should have clear plans and programs that would have impact or greater number of citizens. These should be made and followed through. So space agency should take a much more national public service perspective instead of focusing specifically on academic research, for example, so that you would have more people who can benefit from the capability from the technology. You educate politicians and decision makers. I think for any scientist, this is one of the hardest things that has to be done, because you have to explain a topic that is very high level, such as space, and make it understandable for politicians and decision makers, because they need to understand what is the value and benefit of having a national space program, because without them understanding that, then you would have a very hard time in pushing for legislation and making it into a law. Okay, have very minimal exposure initially. Yes, that's true. But then when everything is laid down, that's the time that you say that, yes, we're doing this. Okay, and you need that to ramp up the public support. This is something that we've experienced for the 3 years that we've been working on the legislation, that initially there were a negative feedback or negative impression on why the Philippines would venture into space development. But over time, because we had a lot of support coming from different partners and sectors, the mindset or the acceptance shifted to a little bit more positive, and people started to understand why we need to do this. Of course, you had to cooperate with other spacefaring and emerging space nations. So it's not just with advanced or established space nations that we should work with, or you should work with, but also with other emerging space nations, because there's a lot of benefit as well for what we call South-South cooperation, because both of your countries are in the same boat, and you can exchange a lot of ideas and learning experiences. So you grow together. And this is the second to the last, includes space law and policy in developing a national space program. And I think this is where the Philippines is very much different compared to other emerging space nations, because right from the very beginning, we had the understanding that we shouldn't just focus on the space technology by having capabilities to develop CubeSats, microsatellites, but also we need to have a clear-cut policy. When you look historically, sometimes space policy is more like an afterthought, that when everything else is established, countries would realize, oh, now we need to have a policy. But in the case of the Philippines, we did it right from the very beginning, that we have a law and a policy in place. And lastly, we always have to remember that any national space agency exists within the ecosystem of the government. So it does not exist on an island, and it is bound by other government laws and procedures, most especially when it comes to budgeting. So you really, really need to have clear programs so that you can justify a higher budget for your agency. And the reality is it would be some ways subject to politics and negotiation. But that is, I think it's not just the Philippines that experiences that, but any national space agency would have that issue. But having that in the mindset and understanding that we need to work with other government agencies so that we can push our own programs really goes a long way in terms of operation. So with that, I'll end my talk with this quote. This is from an African proverb, and this suits very well the experience of the Philippines when it comes to space development. When at the beginning, we did a lot of things very quickly because we were doing it alone, but now we are in the stage that we want to do more, we want to go further. And that's why we want to work with other countries as well. So the African proverb says that if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And that applies very well for space development in any emerging space nation. So with that, thank you very much. And I hope you were able to learn a little bit of something from the experience of the Philippines.
Thank you very much. I think it was very, very enlightening, very interesting keynote. And I always like the previous slide where you kind of outline the main lessons. And as a matter of fact, it corresponds really well to some of the key lessons that we identified in the book. And the reason for that is that you did for the Philippines what we try to do in this book. Try to do the real baseline research and look at all the cases. And I think it's obvious that you made a lot of this work in advance, and that shows into the policy that is very comprehensive and well thought policy for the Philippines. So I was saying that we will have the question in the panel, which I intend to do. But there is one question that is so specific to the case of the Philippines that I think it's better that you answer it very quickly now. So from Naoko Sugita from JAXA, who asks, Dr. Sese, thank you very much for your presentation. If I understand correctly, the Space Education Institute gets most of the space budget, followed by PAGASA and NAMRIA. Is this correct? And could you say it reflects the priority in Philippine space policy? If you could briefly explain these acronyms to that will help. Okay.
SEI is the Science Education Institute, which is actually under the Department of Science and Technology. So the main goal or the main mandate of SEI in terms of space development is mainly on space education side. So in the grand scheme of things, I know this because I've worked with SEI. I was the focal person of the Philippine Space Science Education Program under SEI. It's actually, we get a very small budget. It's not true that we get a large budget. We have a very small budget that we utilize for popularizing space education in elementary and high school. PAGASA, by virtue of being the country's weather bureau, gets a much larger budget, along with PHIVOX, which is for volcanology and seismology. So they get much larger budget compared to SEI. So it's not true that SEI gets a lot of space budget. There are a lot more space activities being done, particularly for remote sensing in PAGASA and PHIVOX, which enjoys a much larger budget. On the other hand, NAMRIA is the National Mapping and Resource Information Authority, which is under a different department or under the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. So this is more of a national mapping agency. Yes, they utilize space technology primarily for having cadastral maps and standardized maps for the country. And they get a significant amount of budget as well. So to put it shortly, in short, no, it's not true that SEI gets a lot of budget for space. We get a very small chunk. We get change compared to other agencies.
Okay, thank you very much for this comprehensive but short answer so that we can move to the panel.